Are we all fed and watered and feeling rested? Yes? You're in for a good afternoon. If anybody's not been, by the way, Chinese Kitchen, I highly recommend it. And from a guy that likes his food, that's a good recommendation, let me tell you. Now, I have the pleasure of speaking at many events around the world with all different... I've introduced rock stars, I've introduced members of the royal family, and I get sent bios to read. And it's not often that I have to stop and really think about those bios. And I've brought my iPad out for this because my eyes are starting to fail me slightly at 48 years old, because I want to make sure that I read this one correctly. So please listen up for this, okay? Cyntoia Brown Long is an author, consultant, and advocate for criminal justice reform and the victims of trafficking. Her memoir, Free Cyntoia, My Search for Redemption in the American Prison System, written whilst in prison, documents her early years and the 15 years she was incarcerated. 15 years. And takes readers on a coming-of-age spiritual journey. Cyntoia hopes her story will not only inspire others, but also shine a light on the injustice many people still face, especially the injustice to women and children in American prisons. Through her firm, JFAM Consultant LLC, Cyntoia works with service providers, judicial bodies, and correctional agencies to provide training, auditing, and coaching that is designed to develop a dignified and empowering approach to corrections, programming, and case management. Alongside her husband, Jamie, she also co-founded the JFAM Foundation to better serve and advocate for individuals who have been affected by human trafficking, youth services involvement, and incarceration. Cyntoia was awarded the 2022 Leadership Prize from the Juvenile Law Center for her work in advocating for justice-involved youth. In January of 2020, the Vera Institute of Justice recognized Cyntoia as one of the best of justice reform honorees. She was a 2020 nominee for the NAACP Literary Image Award and has been featured as a guest columnist for the Washington Post. I hope you listened to that. I hope it touched you as much as I do. Because if that is the intro bio, how amazing is the lady? Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and welcome to the stage, Cyntoia Brown Long.
Good afternoon. Glad all of you made it back from lunch and didn't have to get called. But if you were to go back and examine my upbringing and early home life, you would have never imagined that I would somehow end up living on the streets as a 13-year-old runaway. I grew up in a middle-class military family with two parents who had never run afoul of the law, and there was never a time that I went to bed hungry or didn't have shoes on my feet. I went to church every Sunday morning and Wednesday night, whether I wanted to or not. And my parents did the best they could to shield me from anything that they considered to be a negative influence. If you look at common precursors to criminal justice involvement, you would have never looked twice in my direction. But all that changes whenever you start to look at my life and my experience in the public education system. For young people, school is where you go out and you begin to form relationships outside of your family, your close family friends. It's your first real introduction into the community. And from the first day that I started school, I was treated as an outcast. Everyone's parents had got to bring them into the classroom on that first day, and while my parents got to know my teacher, I sat down and started to get to know my classmates. As everyone in this room knows, children can be brutally honest. As a matter of fact, I can think of a few times that I took a note home for being too honest myself, most notably the time in 3rd grade when my teacher asked me to spit up my gum, and I felt the need to let her know she was the one that needed gum because her breath stank. Don't recommend, did not go well. But either way, I had been sitting at my desk there with my classmates for maybe 10 minutes before they started to interrogate me on why I didn't look like my parents. And it's not something that I had ever given much thought to. I never really felt that I somehow didn't match my family. But looking up to the front of the classroom at the 2 very dark-skinned parents and back down at my very light skin, confusion just started to set in. My mother came to pick me up from school that day. I wasted no time asking her the same questions that had been posed to me. And one question would turn into another, and each answer left me feeling more confused than the last. I was mixed, both black and white. Her and my father had adopted me from a white woman who couldn't take care of me. She tried to reassure me that I was beautiful and that I was loved just the way that I was. But there was this small seed of doubt that settled in my spirit, and I couldn't help but see life through a different lens after that moment. Now I just saw how different I was from everyone. My family, my friends, my church members. In every situation, my mind would automatically distinguish me from those around me. I struggled to adapt socially, and in response, I was withdrawn, especially in the classroom. I preferred to complete my assignments alone, didn't want any help from the teacher or my classmates, didn't want to work in groups. But whenever I rejected help, whenever I said that I preferred not to work in groups, I was labeled by the teachers as having a bad attitude. And I found myself constantly at odds with them. I visited the principal's office on a fairly regular basis, and I quickly became known as the bad kid around the school. The smallest eye roll or smart remark was all the excuse the teacher needed to get me sent to in-school suspension. And after so many trips to ISS, I found myself being suspended altogether. Years ago, I actually had a chance to look at some of those disciplinary reports, and you might expect to see some pretty severe infractions with the number of times I've suspended, but what I found were reports for me calling out answers without raising my hand, humming songs in the classroom, and even one suspension for shaking a stop sign at the bus stop. Now, I may be a bit biased, but that doesn't seem to me to rise to the level of behavior that warrants you being banned from the learning environment. In the 6th grade, I was expelled from public school altogether after bringing a bottle of caffeine pills for show and tell. My mother was forced to enroll me in alternative school clear on the other side of town, and I was only 12 years old, so she had to get the bus worker there at the station to show me how to transfer and how to read the bus routes so that I could get some form of an education. I was the youngest person there at the school. Most of the other kids there were in custody of some form, whether that meant probation or them currently being in an institution. And I was also the youngest of the kids there at that school. Needless to say, it didn't take long before I started skipping school with some of those older kids and getting involved with things that were much more serious than bringing no-dos for show and tell. Less than 6 months from the time that I entered that alternative school, I wound up before the juvenile court judge with charges that I caught with 3 of those older kids that I met there. I was just 12 years old. And when the judge sent me away, it was the first time I was ever away from my parents and forced to sleep in a place that was not my home, surrounded by complete strangers, was unnatural. I wasn't even allowed to call my mom without some approval of a staff member. I couldn't even move from room to room without supervision of some random staff member. When I was sent back home to return to public school, I was more of an outcast than ever before. And it became pretty obvious to me why most of the kids that I met there at the alternative school seemed to walk around with a chip on their shoulder. But naturally, it wasn't long before the school got rid of me once again. This time bypassing alternative school altogether and going through the court to have my probation violated. Oddly enough, I felt a sense of relief whenever I was sent back to return to the facility. I didn't feel out of place there. I felt like I was among my peers and not the bad egg who was constantly being singled out. But being in the facility where every single day there was another fight for basic human rights took a toll on me. So, like most of the other kids that end up in state custody, end up living in state facilities, I ended up running away and living on the streets of Nashville. If I had to pinpoint where things took a turn for the worse in my life, it was definitely the day that I ran away. The 3 years that followed that decision were hands down the most chaotic, traumatic, and reckless times of my life. In that time, I would be raped on numerous occasions. I would be assaulted, threatened, and sold by a man I thought I loved. And at the close of what was certainly one of the darkest chapters of my life, a man would die at my hands. Every day that I was on the run, there was this high drama event that played out, and I slowly became desensitized to a world where every single thing my mother had ever taught me about life was turned on its head. But as hard as it was living on the streets, I didn't feel like an outcast. So I couldn't bring myself to just go home as so many people urged me to do. Even though I was just 13, all of the people that I met while I was on the run were adults. And they had no problem allowing me to do and learn things that no 13-year-old child ever should. These women taught me how to use my conversation and companionship to get money from men. They taught me that my body was a commodity, a God-given money-making tool, they called it. The time I spent around them, I was learning that my identity was tied up with how people valued me. The way I looked, dressed, talked, even the things that I found interest in, all revolved around what I thought would please a man. All the men that I met through these women were much older than me. And having sex was nothing more than a means to make sure I had a roof over my head, clothes on my back, and food in my mouth. At times, being with these men also met my need to feel like I was wanted. There was something empowering about the effect that I had on them and the fact that I was being sought after for something that I could provide them. All these lessons completely altered my worldview, my understanding of relationships. And all those feelings of me wanting to be wanted, to be included, to belong, would eventually culminate into me meeting the man that I would later come to know as my trafficker. At the time, I called him my older boyfriend. He was 24, and I was just 16. And I viewed him as the one person who didn't care about my flaws, my shortcomings, how I looked, and who gave me the attention that I always wanted but never really felt worthy enough to receive. His name was Cut, short for Cutthroat. And if any one of you would have told me that he was actually my pimp, I would have told you were crazy. Even though there were times that I feared him, times that he abused me, the time that I spent with him was primarily marked by this intense longing for his approval. One minute he could make me feel like I was the only girl in the world, and the next, without any provocation whatsoever, he just seemed to despise me. I wanted so bad for him to love me that there was absolutely nothing he could have asked me to do that I would have told him no. He quickly picked up on the fact that my identity revolved around that need to be accepted. I believe that if only I could do all the things to make him smile, to make myself appear valuable to him, that we could just live happily ever after. But there was simply no dollar amount that would make him love me. And each time I found that although I thought I did good, my best was never really good enough, a small part of me just died. On August 7, 2004, Cut sent me from our hotel room for the very last time. And after once again walking into a situation where I was in way over my head, I shot and killed the 43-year-old man who picked me up for sex that night. After I was arrested, I was taken to police headquarters where I was sat in a room lined with cubicles. Two detectives sat across from me and started asking me questions about what had happened. And one of the detectives prefaced the conversation by saying my decision to speak to them could be the difference between me serving 9 years in prison and 99 years in prison. Needless to say, he made the right choice seem pretty obvious. He didn't bother to explain to me that everything I said to them would be construed in the worst possible light. And he didn't dare explain to me the importance of having an attorney be present. So once I confessed, I was taken to juvenile detention. Once again, I found myself going back in my mind to all those suspensions, trips to ISS, expulsions. The familiar feelings of not feeling heard, that the outcome was predetermined, was extremely heavy on me as I made my way through those preliminary hearings. The public defender assigned to my case would visit me there in detention on a regular basis. She seemed fascinated with all these stories I had about life on the run. To her, my life was something out of a movie, and she would sit across the table from me as I explained about how to navigate life on the streets with this strange look on her face. She became determined to get me to see that the way of life that I'd come to know as normal was not normal for a 16-year-old girl. One day after she realized that there was nothing that she could say to get me to also realize that that relationship I couldn't go 15 minutes without talking about wasn't really a relationship, she came up to the detention center with a notepad, and she divided this notepad into 4 sections: things that are good about Cut, things that are bad about Cut, things Cut does to make me feel good, things Cut does to make me feel bad. And as I sat there working, she just sat there quietly and let me process it. And I realized fairly quickly that I didn't have enough room on the page to write all of the things he did to make me feel bad. But I was really struggling to come up with the things he did to make me feel good. And it forced me to realize that I had come to a place where how other people felt was more important to me than my own feelings. I had neglected myself for so long that I couldn't even tell you who I was. As I sat there at that table with her, I couldn't come up with a single adjective to describe my personality, my likes, anything. I become so consumed with living to please other people that I had completely lost myself. For the very first time, my eyes had just become opened. And I started evaluating all the other relationships, all the other truths that I had come to think of as normal. I started to question everything that I had ever been told, and realized that for much of my life, I had allowed other people to dictate my every thought, action, and even the way I viewed myself. When my transfer hearing on those charges came around, the prosecutor on my case fought to convince the judge that there was nothing left to salvage of my 16-year-old life. All that was left was to simply throw me away. In the state of Tennessee, kids who are facing transfer on charges like mine don't stand much of a chance of being kept in the juvenile system. State statute's very rigid in that the only options the judge has is to send the child to state custody for the few years until their 19th birthday, or to transfer them over to be tried as an adult in court. If I was transferred, I would face the same consequences as a similarly charged adult. In my case, that meant that the judge could send me to the same broken DCS system that failed to rehabilitate me for the 2.5 years that I was in their custody, or she could send me over where I could possibly be sentenced to 51 calendar years in prison. In the end, she came to the conclusion that her hands were tied. After the judge ruled to transfer me to adult court, I had to go back to my cell and pack my stuff immediately. And I can remember, I'll never forget as a matter of fact, on the news outside my cell, the district attorney was talking to the reporters. And his words are ingrained into my memory. He told them she's dangerous, and the public needs to be protected a whole lot more than anything that can possibly be done for her. Since I was only 16, once I was transferred to the adult jail, I was placed in solitary confinement. For 2 years, I was kept in a cell the size of most of your bathrooms for 23 hours a day. And for 1 hour a day, I was handcuffed and shackled, taken to a shower, locked in that shower, brought out, allowed to use the phone for 1 hour. Many days, the only sunlight I saw was through a 12-inch cutout in a concrete wall, and the only human interaction from the guard who was bringing me my food tray. Occasionally, I would get visits from my attorney, from church volunteers there at the jail. My mother would come to see me on the weekends, but for most of the time, I was there in the cell alone with my thoughts and with God. Usually, solitary confinement is a treatment reserved for the worst possible individuals. Death row inmates, terrorists. It's been deemed grueling on the psyche of any person who has had to spend even 2 days under those conditions. But for juveniles who have been forced to stand trial as adults, it's the norm. For me, after spending 2 years in solitary confinement, once I was released on my 18th birthday and allowed to live among others, I struggled to learn how to have normal conversations with people, how to interact in social settings. When I finally went to trial a few months after that, I was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison right there on the spot. At one point, the DA showed the jury a naked picture that my trafficker had taken of me as proof of what a horrible person I was. All the more reason they should convict me, because to him, sex trafficking didn't apply to girls who were like me. The jury never got to hear my side of what happened, any of the abuse that I encountered before the night, because my attorneys had advised me not to testify. So I had to sit there with this blank look on my face while a bunch of strangers argued about whether or not I was a monster. Something woke up inside of me after that. I decided I wasn't going to just be this observer in my own life anymore. And furthermore, I wasn't going to allow anyone else to dictate how I was going to live my life. The judge and jury may have told me where I could spend that time, but they couldn't tell me how I would live it. They couldn't rob me of the opportunity to carve out a meaningful existence no matter where I was. I went back to my cell that night after the trial and after the sentence, and I remember just throwing myself onto the bunk in the dark, and I just cried out to God one last time, and I said, if you let me out of here, I get out and I'll tell the world about you. That was the last prayer that I prayed for a while. After that, my belief in a God who sits high and looks low slowly began to fade into anger and frustration, believing that God didn't exist. As a matter of fact, I went around telling anyone who would listen that God did not exist. But even as I was running from him, he managed to find a way to somehow be present for me. 4 years into my sentence, still determined to carve out a meaningful existence, I signed up for this program run by a university called Lipscomb, where they came into the prison and taught college classes. And once I got in, I quickly realized that it was so much more than just a regular college course. I was taken back with how these complete strangers believed in me and were willing to invest into my potential. Beyond that, they provided a community where I finally belonged. And it wasn't because of how I looked, how I didn't look, anything that I did for them. To them, I belonged simply because I was me, and Jesus told them that was enough. I began to grow in ways that I had never imagined possible after that. I finished my associate's degree. I earned a bachelor's degree, maintaining a 4.0 GPA for both of them. I became a mentor to the other women there in the prison. I had gone from wandering the streets of Nashville aimlessly to having opportunities to give advice to government officials right there in the prison on how to change the law and the system for other young girls in my situation. I was literally thriving in a situation that was made to break me. But what I really wanted was my freedom. I was confident that after spending so many years that I had studying the law in the library and developing these relationships with who I considered to be powerful people, maintaining a good record at the institution, that freedom was just a matter of a well-crafted appeal delivered by a seasoned attorney. But even with 7 of the best lawyers that money could buy, including a former Tennessee Supreme Court Chief Justice, a former Court of Criminal Appeals Justice, every single court that I went before to ask them to overturn my conviction told me no. In November 2016, the very last court that I could appeal to denied my appeal and told me that I couldn't go to another court behind them. Any chance that I had of having my sentence overturned by the court was dead. But just when I was starting to think that I may never get out of prison, God sent me a message. It was January 2017 when I received a letter from a man in Texas. He told me that God is bigger than any judge, any jury, any law on this planet, and that he was saying for me to prepare myself because I was about to get out of prison. So I wrote the man back and I told him, I don't believe in God. And he responded simply, that's because you haven't met his son, Jesus. I told him that I grew up with religion, I know all about it. But he taught me that what the Lord desires is relationship. And that was the key word. Relationships had never been my strong point. Everything that I had ever been taught about relationship was transactional, and it always involved me giving way more of myself than the other person was willing to give in return. When I thought of relationships, I thought of all the men who took advantage of me, who abused me. I thought of the so-called friends who led me astray, then disappeared when things went south. But the man from Texas told me that having a relationship with Jesus wasn't about what I could give him in exchange for what he was offering me. On the contrary, there was absolutely nothing that I could possibly do to earn the level of grace that was waiting for me to just accept it. He told me that if I gave him my attention, my time, if I devoted myself to him instead of this world, the world that didn't love me back, the people who saw me as a means to an end, the pursuits that led to absolutely nowhere, that was when I would find fulfillment unlike anything else I had ever experienced in life. And so I opened myself up to getting to know God for who he is, instead of viewing him through this lens of hurt and disappointment that this world brought me. I started spending time in prayer and actually reading the word. And before I knew it, God just began to heal hurts within me that I had carried for over a decade. I rejected all the lies that ever told me that I was shameful, that I was unworthy, that I would forever be defined by the worst possible moments in my life. And I embraced the fact that I was forgiven, I was chosen, and I was set apart by someone who no one on this earth could ever override. Even though I was still surrounded by people who like to use my darkest moments to define me, I held firm to what God told me about his word, and it made all the difference for me. The man from Texas and I began to grow closer as we continued to write these letters back and forth. We started talking on the phone every day, and he'd just become my best friend in some of my darkest moments. I could be vulnerable with him without fear that he would somehow take advantage of me. I never really expected much to come from it. After all, I was sitting in a Tennessee prison serving a life sentence with no appeals left. We couldn't be any more different. He was somewhere in Texas driving around a Bentley, for God's sake. Well, I was forced to ask permission to go outside and walk around in a dog kennel with shackles on. But even when my chances for release seemed bleak, he just continued to encourage me to pray for God's will to be done in my case. He became the prayer warrior that I never even knew I needed. Whenever I would tell him I didn't know if I would ever get out of prison and he should just go on with his life, he would challenge me by saying, there's two reports. There's God's report and there's man's report. And you're going to have to make a decision on who you're going to believe. Lo and behold, less than 3 months from the day that I decided to put my faith in God's report, I got word from my attorneys that the federal court ruled to reopen that appeal that they closed, that they had denied. It was something that none of them had ever experienced in all of their decades of practicing the law. When I excitedly told this man from Texas about it, he just replied, "Why are you surprised?" He was so assured in his faith that there was never a doubt in his mind that God was going to do exactly what he said he was going to do. But I was new to the faith walk, so it was hard for me to wrap my mind around the fact that what happened in the spiritual realm had actual ramifications here in the physical realm. In March 2018, God spoke very clearly to the man once again, telling him I was getting out of prison. And a few weeks prior to that, the Lord told his pastor, Tim McGee, that we would receive a date during the month of March that would put me one step closer to being released. I had already filed the clemency petition, but I knew that less than 1% of people actually get a response, much less a hearing from the parole board. But by this time, I also knew that faith was the key to unlocking any door. So when the man from Texas told me a second time that God said I was about to get out, I started going through all my stuff there at the prison, giving away things, and I packed up this small bag that I would carry out the door with me. Just 2 weeks later, on the very last day of March, we got word through my attorneys that I was given a date for a hearing on my clemency petition. Now, I had read stories in the Bible about people hearing from God and things actually coming to pass, but to actually witness Pastor Tim saying that I would get a date in March and then actually getting that date in March just left me in awe. To me, that meant that the God of the entire universe was personally involved in my case, and he was actively working out my situation. So even though I was once told by a judge and a jury that I would be 67 years old before I could ever possibly meet with the parole board, in May of 2018, when I was just 30 years old, I actually met with the parole board. By this point, it was evident to me that, as that man from Texas once told me in the letter, God is bigger than any judge, any jury, any law on this planet. And now there was no disputing that he was personally involved in my case. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that when the Lord told him I was getting out of prison, he meant that. So now, instead of worrying about how I could think my way out of prison, I spent every day just getting to know God for who he is and speaking faith to what seemed an impossible situation. The man from Texas and I were still sitting on that prison phone, and we were praying for God's will to be done in my case, and we took it a step further, and we prayed for God to touch the hearts and minds of every single person who would so much as lay a finger on my petition that I had filed. As we prayed, we started to see support for my case grow tremendously, beyond anything that we could have ever imagined. But for more than 6 months from the time that I had that hearing, there was silence. There were people around us that tried to speak doubt on our situation during this time, quoting odds and worst-case scenarios, but we decided that we were going to remain steadfast and believe what God had told us to be true. We knew it was him who had the authority to determine the final outcome. And then after what seemed like months of silence, I started to have dreams. These weren't ordinary dreams. When I woke from them, I just knew that it was the Lord speaking to me. In the dream, I was being released from prison, and it was dark, and it had been raining all night. When I told the man from Texas, we both knew that this is the Lord speaking to us. So we just started watching the newscasts every single day thinking, well, this is going to be the day when it rains, that I'm walking out of here. But even more months would pass without a word from the governor's office. So in the last few days of 2018, the man, you know what, let me just give this man a name. His name is Jamie, and he's sitting here. In the last few days of 2018, Jamie started urging me to go around and speak to the prison walls. I'm sure people looked at me like I had lost my mind, but that's what I did. I went around and I started rebuking those walls, and I told them that my God had said I was set free, and they had to comply. And because of that, guess what? In January 7th, 2019, I was called down to the prison's visitation area and told that I was being set free by the governor. The first thing I did after hearing that news was I married that man from Texas, AKA Jamie, best known as the man who helped me build the faith that freed me. I didn't even wait till I set foot on free land. We had Pastor Tim marry us from right there in the prison. There was no way that I was going to spend another day of my life not being his wife. For the past 2 years, this man had devoted his entire life, spent his nights awake praying for me, covering me, warring in the spirit on my behalf. I forgot to mention, y'all, he sold his Bentley too. And any man that sells his dream car, like, that's a keeper. That's a keeper. So back in November, while we were still waiting, while what we call our wilderness period, when we weren't hearing any word, God spoke to him and he said, you know what? Get up and go to Tennessee. Go get your wife. And so he didn't have a plan. He didn't know a soul in Tennessee, but he got rid of everything he owned here in Texas, packed up and moved there. And when I asked him why, he simply said, the Lord told me to go get my wife. So that's what I'm doing. And just like in the dreams that I had, in the middle of the night on August 7th, 2019, I stormed the entire night just like I had dreamed. He got to do just that, and he picked me up from the prison. Before I get off of here, I just want to tell you guys that many times we look at mistakes people make and convince ourselves that that's indicative of who they're going to be for the rest of their lives. But the fact of the matter is, people can't be defined by just one moment in time, one decision that they make. I'll never forget the DA in my case implying that there was nothing else that could be done for me, because now I get to recite that every single time I get to stand up here flat-footed and tell y'all that I was once written off, labeled a lost cause, but am living proof that God can turn any life around. I don't know where you are in your journey. You might not know where you are in your journey, but I just want to remind you that it's just that. It's a journey. My own journey took over a decade to make sense. But that entire time, God was working things out for my good. There'll be times in your journey that you may feel he doesn't hear you, but God doesn't ignore his children. He sees you, he hears you, and he has a plan for your life, a plan that's going to bring glory to his kingdom. So in conclusion, I just want to say thank you for having us. Thank you for allowing me to share our testimony, and all glory to God. Thank you.
Well, I told you it was going to be amazing. Thank you. And I did shed some tears, which you'll all be a bit shocked to think about while I was listening to that story. That was incredible. I actually had the pleasure of having lunch with these two guys, and I never met Jamie before in my life. And I walked into the restaurant, and my dinner was laid out before me. And just speaking to them and hearing their story and what you've seen so far, it's amazing, right? Yeah? That's where you all go, yeah, Matt. It's amazing, yeah? Well, we're going to break for a couple of minutes just to reflect on it. And then we're going to hear another part of the story as well, because Jamie's going to come up and speak to you as well. Couple of minutes break, guys, to reflect. Thank you.